London, 1875, A Chronicle of the Imperial Capital, Chapter 1. The Metropolis Awakens. The year 1875 found London at the zenith of Victorian confidence, a sprawling metropolis of approximately 4 million souls, the largest city the world had ever known. As dawn broke over the Thames each morning, the great machinery of empire stirred to life with a symphony of sounds that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. The river itself remained London's principal artery, though its character had transformed dramatically. The Thames in 1875 was a working river, perpetually crowded with vessels of every description. Massive steamships from the far reaches of the British Empire jostled for position alongside traditional sailing barges that had plied these waters for centuries. The Pool of London, stretching from London Bridge to Limehouse, presented a forest of masts so dense that one contemporary observer claimed you could walk from shore to shore by stepping from deck to deck without ever touching water. The riverbanks bore witness to London's industrial might. Vast warehouses lined the Thames, their brick facades blackened by decades of coal smoke. These buildings stored the wealth of empire: tea from India and Ceylon, rubber from Malaya, wool from Australia, tobacco from Virginia, sugar from the Caribbean. The smell of these commodities mingled in the air: spices, coffee, rum, timber, creating an olfactory map of British global dominance. The docks themselves were recent innovations. The enclosed dock system, with its high walls and vigilant security, had been developed to combat the endemic theft that plagued open wharves. St. Catherine Docks, London Docks, Surrey Commercial Docks, Millwall Docks, each specialized in different cargoes. Each employed thousands of laborers whose livelihoods depended on the tides of international trade. Crossing the river required navigating one of the bridges that had multiplied across the Thames. London Bridge, rebuilt in 1831, carried an astonishing volume of traffic. Contemporary estimates suggested that 20,000 vehicles and countless thousands of pedestrians crossed it daily. Waterloo Bridge, opened in 1817, was considered by many the finest bridge in Europe, its 9 elegant arches spanning the river with remarkable grace. The newest crossing was the Albert Bridge at Chelsea, completed in 1873, its delicate suspension design already showing signs of the structural weakness that would plague it for generations. Tower Bridge, which would become London's most iconic crossing, did not yet exist. The Tower of London itself stood much as it had for centuries, though by 1875 it had been thoroughly domesticated, serving primarily as an armory and a tourist attraction where the crown jewels could be viewed for a small fee. The morning routine of London began earliest among the working classes. In the East End, the poorest districts awakened before dawn. Men, women, and children emerged from cramped lodgings to begin their various labors. Matchgirls headed to the factories where they would spend 12-hour days dipping wooden splints in phosphorus, a process that would eventually cause the horrific jaw disease known as phossy jaw. Dock laborers gathered at the dock gates for the daily ritual of calling on, where foremen selected workers from the desperate crowds, leaving the unlucky to try again the next day or seek whatever casual work might be found. Street vendors prepared their wares. Costermongers arranged vegetables and fruits on their barrows, ready to wheel them through the streets with distinctive cries that formed part of London's acoustic landscape. Pie sellers, milk sellers, knife grinders, chair menders, crossing sweepers, an entire informal economy mobilized each morning, seeking pennies from passers-by. The middle classes rose somewhat later in their terraced houses in suburbs like Islington, Camberwell, or Clapham. Servants, for even modest middle-class households typically employed at least one maid, had already lit fires, prepared breakfast, and begun the daily round of cleaning that the coal-burning city demanded. The soot was relentless. Everything required constant washing, dusting, and polishing. By 8 o'clock, the morning rush to the city was in full swing. The railways had revolutionized middle-class life, making suburban living practical. Commuters poured into the great railway termini that ringed central London. Paddington, Euston, King's Cross, Liverpool Street, Waterloo, Victoria. These vast iron and glass cathedrals to progress disgorged thousands upon thousands of clerks, accountants, merchants, and professionals who made the engine of commerce run. The omnibus system supplemented the railways. These horse-drawn vehicles, typically carrying 12 inside passengers and another 14 on the open upper deck, traveled fixed routes throughout the city. A journey cost 3d to 6d, depending on distance. The omnibus conductors were notorious characters, often rough men who collected fares while performing acrobatic feats, leaping on and off the moving vehicles with practiced ease. For those who could afford it, the hansom cab offered private transport. These two-wheeled carriages, pulled by a single horse with the driver seated behind and above the passenger compartment, were the taxis of Victorian London. They moved at remarkable speed through the crowded streets, their drivers possessing an intimate knowledge of London's labyrinthine lanes and shortcuts. The streets themselves presented a spectacle of controlled chaos. The roadways were paved with wooden blocks or granite sets, creating a tremendous clatter as iron-shod wheels and horses' hooves struck the hard surfaces. Traffic moved on the left, a convention already well established, but the density of vehicles created constant jams and delays. Private carriages, commercial wagons, omnibuses, cabs, and the occasional herd of cattle being driven to market competed for space. The noise was extraordinary. The clatter of hooves and wheels combined with the shouts of drivers, the cries of street vendors, the bells of churches, and the whistles of trains and factory sirens to create a din that visitors from quieter provincial towns found overwhelming. One could barely hold a conversation on a busy street without raising one's voice. The animal presence in the city was ubiquitous. London's transport and commerce depended entirely on horses, and the city housed an estimated 300,000 of them. Each horse produced between 15 and 30 pounds of manure daily, creating a disposal problem of staggering proportions. Crossing sweepers, often children or elderly poor, made a living by clearing paths through the muck for better-dressed pedestrians in exchange for small coins. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Empire. The London skyline of 1875 was dramatically different from both what had come before and what would come after. Church spires still dominated the vista, particularly Wren's masterpiece, St. Paul's Cathedral, whose dome rose 365 feet above Ludgate Hill. Yet new structures proclaimed a different kind of faith in commerce, industry, and imperial destiny. The Houses of Parliament, completed in 1870 with the finishing of the Victoria Tower, represented the pinnacle of Gothic revival architecture. Charles Barry and Augustus Pugin's masterwork stretched along the Thames, its intricate stonework and soaring towers deliberately evoking England's medieval past while housing the machinery of the world's most powerful democracy. The Great Clock Tower, housing Big Ben, had become London's most recognizable landmark, its bells marking time for the imperial capital. Walking through central London, one encountered a city rebuilding itself with unprecedented confidence. The slums and medieval warrens that had characterized 18th-century London were steadily disappearing, replaced by broad boulevards and substantial buildings that expressed Victorian values, permanence, prosperity, and moral seriousness. The Strand, connecting the City of London to Westminster, showcased this transformation. Grand hotels like the Savoy, though the current Savoy Hotel would not be built until 1889, hotels occupied the site, catered to wealthy travelers. Restaurants, shops selling luxury goods, newspaper offices, and theaters lined the street. The new Charing Cross railway station and hotel, completed in 1864, demonstrated how railway companies were reshaping the urban landscape, demolishing entire neighborhoods to lay their tracks and build their termini. Regent Street, designed by John Nash earlier in the century, remained one of London's most fashionable thoroughfares. Its elegant curved colonnades sheltered shoppers from weather as they browsed windows displaying the finest goods the empire could provide. Here, one could purchase anything: French wines, Indian silks, Chinese porcelain, African ivory, Australian gold. Oxford Street had evolved into London's premier shopping destination. The department store was revolutionizing retail, and establishments like Marshall and Snellgrove, Peter Robinson, and John Lewis offered an entirely new shopping experience. These vast emporiums gathered under one roof the multitude of goods that previously required visits to numerous specialized shops. They featured fixed prices, a radical innovation when bargaining remained common, and employed hundreds of shop assistants, predominantly young women who worked long hours for modest wages. The West End represented wealth and leisure. Mayfair, Belgravia, and Kensington contained the townhouses of the aristocracy and the newly wealthy. These neighborhoods featured squares and crescents of white stuccoed buildings, their regularized facades presenting a vision of classical harmony and social hierarchy. Behind these elegant exteriors, the great houses maintained staffs of dozens: butlers, footmen, housekeepers, ladies' maids, cooks, scullery maids, grooms, coachmen, all working to maintain the lifestyle of their employers. Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens provided green space where fashionable society could see and be seen. Rotten Row, the broad riding path in Hyde Park, witnessed daily parades of the upper classes on horseback during the social season. The park also served as a venue for public gatherings, demonstrations, and spectacles of various kinds. The British Museum, with its magnificent Greek Revival facade designed by Robert Smirke and completed in 1852, housed treasures from across the empire and throughout history. The museum embodied Britain's role as heir to classical civilization and guardian of global culture. The controversial Elgin marbles, removed from the Parthenon, occupied pride of place, while Egyptian antiquities, Assyrian sculptures, and countless other artifacts demonstrated British archaeological and imperial reach. The National Gallery in Trafalgar Square, completed in 1838, had recently added a new east wing. Its collection of European paintings was rapidly expanding, funded by parliamentary grants and private donations. The gallery represented the democratization of culture. Admission was free, allowing even working-class Londoners to view masterworks previously accessible only to aristocratic collectors. South Kensington had emerged as London's museum district, a direct result of the 1851 Great Exhibition. The profits from that spectacular event, held in Hyde Park's Crystal Palace, had funded the purchase of land in South Kensington and the construction of several museums. The South Kensington Museum, later renamed the Victoria and Albert Museum, opened in stages from 1857 onward, celebrating decorative arts and design. The Natural History Museum was under construction, though it would not open until 1881. The Royal Albert Hall, opened in 1871, provided a vast circular venue for concerts and public events. Its distinctive dome dominated the South Kensington skyline, and the building could accommodate 8,000 people. The Albert Memorial, directly opposite in Kensington Gardens, was completed in 1872, a soaring Gothic monument to Queen Victoria's beloved late husband, encrusted with sculptures, mosaics, and precious materials in an exuberant display of Victorian taste. Commercial architecture reflected London's status as the world's financial capital. The City of London, the square mile that had been the original walled medieval city, was being rebuilt with massive stone and brick buildings housing banks, insurance companies, and trading firms. The Bank of England, continuously expanded throughout the century, occupied an entire city block. The Royal Exchange, rebuilt after an 1838 fire, provided a trading floor where merchants conducted international business. The new law courts on the Strand were under construction in 1875, designed by George Edmund Street in an elaborate Gothic style. When completed in 1882, they would provide centralized facilities for Britain's superior courts, replacing the scattered and inadequate medieval buildings previously used. Railway architecture represented Victorian engineering triumph. The great railway termini were vast iron and glass structures, their train sheds spanning enormous distances without interior supports. St. Pancras Station, completed in 1868, featured the widest single-span train shed in the world at 243 feet. The Midland Grand Hotel, designed by George Gilbert Scott, rose before it in a Gothic fantasy of spires, turrets, and polychrome brickwork. Yet for all this impressive construction, much of London remained crowded, unsanitary, and dangerous. Behind the grand boulevards and monuments lay vast districts of working-class housing where families lived in single rooms, where water had to be carried from street pumps, and where sanitation consisted of shared outdoor privies that emptied into cesspools, or, if one was fortunate, sewers. Chapter 3. Society and Class. London in 1875 was a city of profound inequality, where the accident of birth determined life's trajectory with near absolute certainty. The social pyramid was steep and rigid, though not quite impermeable. At the apex sat the aristocracy, comprising perhaps a few thousand individuals who owned vast estates, wielded political power, and set the tone for fashionable society. These were the dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, and barons, along with their families. Many maintained multiple residences, a country estate, a London townhouse for the season, perhaps a Scottish shooting lodge, or a villa on the continent. The season dominated aristocratic life from April to July. This was when Parliament sat, when society balls, dinner parties, and cultural events occurred in rapid succession, when mothers presented their daughters at court and launched them into the marriage market. The season required elaborate wardrobes, constant entertaining, and adherence to complex social protocols. Gentlemen's clubs provided refuges where aristocratic and upper-middle-class men could dine, converse, and conduct business away from female company. White's, Brooks's, the Carlton, the Reform, each had its particular political or social character. Membership was exclusive and highly prized. These wood-paneled sanctuaries in St. James's provided libraries, dining rooms, and spaces for gambling. Below the aristocracy sat the upper middle class, a group growing rapidly in wealth and influence. Successful merchants, bankers, industrialists, and professionals could accumulate fortunes rivaling those of the landed gentry. They purchased country estates, sent their sons to public schools like Eton and Harrow, and emulated aristocratic lifestyles. The broader middle class was extraordinarily diverse, ranging from prosperous doctors and lawyers to struggling clerks earning barely enough to maintain respectability. What united them was a commitment to respectability, a term that encompassed moral behavior, clean living, regular church attendance, and maintenance of proper appearances. Middle-class life centered on the home, which was understood as a sacred space, a refuge from the corrupt commercial world. The wife and mother was the angel in the house, responsible for creating a moral and comfortable domestic environment. Servants made this possible, cleaning, cooking, and performing the hard labor of maintaining a household while allowing the mistress to focus on her children's education and moral development. Middle-class men worked in offices, counting houses, and professional chambers. The city employed tens of thousands of clerks who spent their days copying documents, maintaining accounts, and facilitating the paperwork of global commerce. These were respectable positions, requiring literacy, numeracy, and appropriate dress. A clerk might earn £100 to £200 per year, enough to rent a modest house, employ a single servant, and maintain a family, provided the wife was skilled at household management. The lower middle class occupied a precarious position. Shopkeepers, school teachers, minor clerks, and skilled artisans aspired to middle-class respectability but lacked secure incomes. They rented rather than owned property, struggled to afford servants, and lived in constant anxiety about falling into the working class. The working class comprised the majority of Londoners. This designation encompassed enormous variety: skilled craftsmen who commanded good wages and enjoyed workplace autonomy, factory workers subjected to industrial discipline and mechanized routines, casual laborers who scrambled for employment day by day, domestic servants who lived in their employers' homes, skilled workers, carpenters, printers, engineers, masons, formed a labor aristocracy. They earned perhaps £2 to £3 per week, enough to rent comfortable rooms, feed and clothe their families adequately, and perhaps save a little. They took pride in their work and often organized in trade unions to protect their interests. Factory workers faced a different existence. The industrial districts of East London housed vast manufactories producing everything from matches to soap to processed foods. The work was repetitive, dangerous, and exhausting. Women and children formed much of the workforce, employed because they could be paid less than men. A factory girl might work 12 hours a day for 6 shillings a week. Domestic service employed more women than any other occupation. Hundreds of thousands of young women worked as maids, cooks, nannies, and housekeepers in middle and upper-class homes. The work was hard, hauling water and coal, scrubbing floors, washing laundry by hand, preparing meals over coal fires. Hours were long, personal freedom was minimal, and wages were modest, though room and board were provided. Life in service varied enormously depending on the household. A position in an aristocratic household offered prestige and the possibility of advancement through the servant hierarchy. Such establishments employed dozens of servants, each with specific duties and ranks. The upper servants, butler, housekeeper, lady's maid, valet, enjoyed considerable authority and better working conditions than the lower servants who did the hardest and dirtiest work. At the bottom of the social pyramid existed London's poor, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. These were people who lacked regular employment, who lived in the worst housing, who went hungry more often than not. Charles Booth's later survey of London poverty, conducted in the 1880s and 1890s, would reveal that nearly 1/3 of Londoners lived in poverty. The East End embodied this poverty. Whitechapel, Spitalfields, Bethnal Green, Stepney. These districts housed immigrants, casual laborers, and the desperately poor in rookeries and tenements. Entire families lived in single rooms. Disease was rampant. Infant mortality rates were horrific, with half of all children dying before age 5 in the worst districts. The casual labor system trapped people in poverty. Dock work, street selling, washing, sewing. These jobs provided irregular income, insufficient to cover basic needs. People pawned possessions on Monday to buy food, redeemed them on Saturday when work had provided a few shillings, then repeated the cycle endlessly. Women's economic position was particularly precarious. Widows, abandoned wives, and unmarried mothers struggled to support themselves and children. Respectable occupations for working-class women, sewing, washing, charring, paid starvation wages. the temptation or necessity of prostitution was ever present. Estimates suggested 80,000 prostitutes worked in London, though such figures were inherently unreliable. The workhouse represented the ultimate degradation. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 had established a system of workhouses designed to be so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would seek admission. Families were separated, inmates wore uniforms, performed hard labor, and endured a regime designed to be deterrent. Yet for the destitute elderly, the disabled, orphan children, and the utterly destitute, the workhouse was the last refuge. Crime flourished in this environment. Professional criminals operated throughout London, from sophisticated con artists who preyed on the wealthy to desperate pickpockets stealing pennies from market shoppers. Entire neighborhoods developed reputations as criminal rookeries, where police ventured only in groups. The police themselves were a relatively recent innovation. The Metropolitan Police, established in 1829, had gradually expanded to cover London. The distinctive blue uniforms and top hats of the bobbies, or peelers, named after founder Sir Robert Peel, were now familiar sights. The police worked 12-hour shifts, walking beats that covered several miles. Their presence represented order, though their effectiveness at preventing or solving crime was debatable. Chapter 4. Daily Life and Domestic Conditions. The texture of daily life in 1875. London was fundamentally shaped by technologies and limitations that would seem extraordinary to later generations. The city ran on coal and muscle power, on gaslight and oil lamps, on water delivered by pipes that ran only intermittently, on sewers that were modern marvels but far from universal. The day began early in most households. For the working class, this meant waking in darkness during winter months, in rooms that were bitterly cold. Coal fires provided heat, but coal cost money. Many families kept fires burning only in one room, or lit them only in the evening. Chilblains, the painful inflammation caused by exposure to cold and poor circulation, afflicted rich and poor alike, though the poor suffered more severely. Water supply had improved dramatically following the Great Stink of 1858, when the smell of the polluted Thames became so overwhelming that Parliament was forced to act. Sir Joseph Bazalgette's monumental sewer system, completed in 1865, channeled London's waste to treatment facilities downriver. This engineering triumph dramatically reduced cholera and other waterborne diseases. However, water remained expensive and inconvenient for many Londoners. In poorer neighborhoods, water might be available from street pumps only at certain hours. Hauling water for cooking, washing, and bathing was arduous work. Many working-class families bathed infrequently, lacking both facilities and fuel to heat sufficient water. Middle-class homes had water piped in, though it might not run continuously. A cistern in the attic stored water pumped up when supply was available. Bathrooms, as we understand them, were rare. Most homes had a hip bath, a large tin tub that would be filled with hot water heated on the kitchen stove and placed before the fire. Bathing was typically a weekly event, the bath water being used by multiple family members in turn. Toilets varied enormously. The wealthy had water closets, porcelain fixtures connected to the sewer system. The middle classes might have outdoor earth closets or shared facilities. The poor used communal privies, cesspits, and chamber pots emptied into street gutters or into the courtyards of tenement buildings. Lighting was in transition. Gas lighting had become common in middle and upper-class homes by 1875. Gas pipes ran through the house to fixtures in major rooms, providing light that was brighter than candles or oil lamps, but still dim by modern standards. Gas mantles, which would dramatically improve gas lighting efficiency, had not yet been invented. Poor families still relied on candles, rushlight, or small oil lamps, living much of their lives in semi-darkness. Food and cooking occupied enormous time and effort. For the working class, the diet was monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. Bread, tea, potatoes, and occasionally bacon or cheese formed the staples. Fresh vegetables and fruits were expensive and seasonal. Milk was often adulterated or contaminated. Meat was a luxury for special occasions. Middle-class families ate more varied and nutritious meals, but food preparation was laborious. Cooking was done on coal-burning ranges that required skill to manage. The kitchen was hot, dirty, and dominated by the need to maintain the fire. Shopping was a daily necessity, since home refrigeration did not exist. Ice boxes, cooled by blocks of ice delivered by ice sellers, were available but expensive. Street markets provided food for working-class Londoners. Covent Garden, Smithfield, Billingsgate. These vast markets operated throughout the night and early morning, wholesalers selling to retailers who then dispersed throughout the city. By mid-morning, costermongers' barrows appeared on street corners, selling vegetables, fruits, fish, and cheap cuts of meat. Adulteration of food was widespread. Bakers added alum to flour to make bread whiter. Tea was bulked up with used leaves, colored with chemicals. Milk was watered down and sometimes mixed with chalk. Candy contained poisonous dyes. The food industry was largely unregulated, and consumers had little protection against fraud or contamination. Clothing reflected social status with precision. Upper-class dress was elaborate and expensive, requiring servants to help with fastening. Women's fashion in 1875 featured tight corsets, elaborate bustles, and multiple layers of petticoats, skirts, and bodices. A lady might change clothing several times during the day: morning dress, afternoon dress, tea gown, dinner dress, ball gown, each appropriate to the activity. Men's fashion was more restrained but equally codified. Frock coats for day wear, morning coats for formal day occasions, tailcoats for evening, trousers, waistcoats, shirts with detachable collars and cuffs. The proper gentleman required an extensive wardrobe and a valet to maintain it. Working-class clothing was simpler and more durable. Men wore heavy wool trousers, shirts, waistcoats, and jackets. Caps rather than the hats worn by middle-class men. Women wore long skirts, blouses, shawls, and aprons. Clothing was expensive relative to wages, so garments were worn until thoroughly worn out, patched and mended repeatedly. The second-hand clothing trade was enormous, with street markets selling used garments to those who could not afford new. Children's lives varied dramatically by class. Upper and middle-class children were educated at home by governesses or sent to schools. Boys of wealthy families attended public schools like Eton, Harrow, or Winchester, preparing for Oxford or Cambridge. Girls received education in accomplishments, music, drawing, French, needlework, designed to make them attractive marriage prospects. Working-class children often worked from age 10 or younger. The 1870 Elementary Education Act had established the principle of universal elementary education, and board schools were being built to provide it. However, education was not yet compulsory or free. Many working-class families could not afford to forego children's wages, and children continued working in factories, workshops, and streets. Health and medicine were primitive by modern standards. Infant and child mortality rates were appalling. Life expectancy at birth was approximately 40 years, though this figure was heavily influenced by high infant mortality. Those who survived childhood might live into their 60s or 70s, though chronic illness and disability were common. Medical knowledge was advancing rapidly. The germ theory of disease was gaining acceptance, though many doctors still clung to older miasma theories. Anesthesia had revolutionized surgery, allowing operations previously impossible. However, antiseptic techniques were only beginning to be adopted. Many surgical patients still died from post-operative infections. Hospitals were primarily for the poor. The wealthy were treated at home. London's great teaching hospitals, Guy's, St. Thomas E.S., St. Bartholomew Saul E.S., the London Hospital, provided care to thousands but had limited capacity and even more limited ability to cure serious illnesses. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, killed more people than any other disease. Cholera epidemics, while less frequent than earlier in the century thanks to improved water and sanitation, still occurred. Scarlet fever, typhus, smallpox, and numerous other infectious diseases took terrible tolls. Chapter 5. Culture, Entertainment, and Intellectual Life. London in 1875 was the cultural capital of the English-speaking world, a city where intellectual and artistic life flourished despite, or perhaps because of, the vast social inequalities and rapid changes transforming society. The theater thrived. The West End featured dozens of playhouses offering everything from Shakespeare to melodrama, from music halls to opera. The Lyceum Theatre, under the management of Henry Irving, was becoming the premier venue for serious drama. Irving would revolutionize theatrical production with his attention to staging, lighting, and realistic detail. Music halls provided entertainment for the working and lower middle classes. These venues offered variety programs, singers, dancers, comedians, acrobats, in a rowdy atmosphere where the audience ate, drank, and participated vocally. Songs like Champagne Charlie and The Boy I Love Is Up in the Gallery became immensely popular. Music halls were considered slightly disreputable by respectable society, but were enormously popular. Covent Garden Opera House staged opera and ballet for elite audiences. The social aspect was as important as the performance, seeing and being seen in one's box, wearing the latest fashions, discussing who was or was not present. The opera season was part of the larger social season. Literature was experiencing a golden age. Many of the century's greatest novelists were at their peak or still producing work. George Eliot was writing Daniel Deronda, which would be published in 1876. Anthony Trollope continued his prolific output, capturing the intricacies of upper-middle-class life and politics. Thomas Hardy was beginning his career with novels that explored rural life and fate. The serialization of novels in magazines made literature accessible to a wider audience. Charles Dickens had died in 1870, but his works remained enormously popular and influential. His vivid portrayal of London's poor, criminals, and eccentrics had shaped how people understood their city. His public readings had been theatrical events, drawing thousands. Poetry remained a respected form. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, was poet laureate, embodying Victorian literary respectability. Robert Browning continued producing complex psychological poetry. The pre-Raphaelite poets, including Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Christina Rossetti, offered a different aesthetic, emphasizing medieval imagery and intense emotion. Publishing was a major industry. Mudie's circulating library and similar institutions made books available to middle-class readers who could not afford to purchase the expensive multi-volume editions in which most novels were published. Publishers like Macmillan, Chapman, and Hall, and Smith, Elder, issued not only fiction, but also the scientific, philosophical, and political works that characterized the age's intellectual ferment. Periodicals proliferated. The Times remained the newspaper of record, but numerous other dailies competed for readers. The Illustrated London News, Punch, and many others combined news, commentary, and entertainment. Magazines catering to every interest and class existed: religious magazines, literary journals, women's magazines, sporting papers, trade publications. Science was advancing at an extraordinary pace, and London was a center of this progress. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, continued its role as Britain's premier scientific institution. The Linnean Society, the Royal Astronomical Society, and numerous other learned bodies provided venues for presenting research and discussion. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, continued to provoke fierce debate. By 1875, most scientists accepted evolution, though public and religious opinion remained divided. The implications of evolutionary theory for human origins and humanity's place in nature were profoundly unsettling to Victorian religious faith. The British Museum's natural history collections were expanding rapidly. Specimens arrived from across the empire: exotic animals, plants, fossils, minerals. These collections served both scientific research and public education, though they also represented the appropriation of global natural resources by the imperial power. Technology was transforming daily life. The telegraph had made instant communication possible across vast distances. The Atlantic cable, successfully laid in 1866, connected Europe and America. News that once took weeks to travel now arrived within hours. This acceleration of information flow was as revolutionary in its way as the Internet would be a century later. Photography was becoming accessible. Photographic studios existed throughout London, offering portrait photography to middle and even working-class families. Carte de visite, small photographs mounted on cards, became collectible items. People assembled albums of family members, friends, and celebrities. Zoos and museums provided education and entertainment. The Zoological Gardens in Regent's Park, established in 1828, housed exotic animals from across the empire. The zoo was both a scientific institution and a popular attraction where Londoners could encounter elephants, lions, monkeys, and other creatures they would never otherwise see. The British Museum offered free admission to all, though the working classes seldom visited. The museum represented Victorian faith in progress and education, the belief that exposing people to great art and scientific knowledge would improve them morally and intellectually. Religion remained central to most people's lives, though religious certainty was being challenged by scientific discoveries, biblical criticism, and the obvious failures of Christian society to address poverty and injustice. Church attendance was high among the middle classes, less so among the working poor. The Church of England remained the established church, its bishops sitting in the House of Lords, its parishes covering the entire country. However, religious diversity was increasing. Catholic emancipation earlier in the century had allowed Catholics to practice openly. Jewish communities, though facing discrimination, were established in London. Nonconformist Protestant denominations, Methodists, Baptists, Congregationalists, attracted many followers, particularly among the working and lower middle classes. Social reform movements often had religious motivations. The temperance movement, which sought to reduce alcohol consumption, was driven largely by religious groups who saw drunkenness as a moral failing, destroying working-class families. The movement for improved working conditions, better housing, and education similarly drew on Christian beliefs about human dignity and social responsibility. The Salvation Army, founded by William Booth in East London in 1865, combined evangelical Christianity with social work. The Army's brass bands, street preaching, and direct assistance to the poor represented a new form of religious activism that engaged with urban poverty rather than simply preaching at it. Women's roles were contested terrain. The separate spheres ideology held that men belonged in the public world of work and politics, while women belonged in the domestic sphere of home and family. However, This ideology never matched reality for working-class women who had always worked, and middle-class women were increasingly challenging these limitations. The women's suffrage movement was gaining momentum. The first women's suffrage petition had been presented to Parliament in 1866. While success would not come until the 20th century, the campaign was establishing arguments and organizations that would eventually prevail. Women were entering higher education. The University of London had begun granting degrees to women in 1878. Women's colleges at Cambridge and Oxford provided education even though the universities would not grant degrees to women for decades. These developments challenged fundamental assumptions about women's intellectual capacities. Chapter 6: Infrastructure, Services, and the Modern City. By 1875, London was becoming a recognizably modern city, with infrastructure and services that represented remarkable engineering achievements and organizational complexity. The Victorian era witnessed a fundamental transformation in how cities functioned, driven by new technologies and increasing recognition that urban life required coordinated public services. The Metropolitan Board of Works, established in 1855, coordinated major infrastructure projects across London. Its greatest achievement was Bazalgette's sewer system, but it also improved streets, built embankments, and created parks. The board represented a new approach to urban governance, recognizing that the piecemeal, parish-based administration of earlier eras could not manage a city of millions. The Thames Embankment, completed in stages between 1868 and 1874, exemplified Victorian engineering ambition. These massive constructions reclaimed land from the river, created new roadways, housed major sewer pipes, and provided riverside promenades. The embankment transformed the Thames riverfront from a series of muddy, unstable banks and wharves into an orderly public space. Gas supply was a major municipal service. Multiple private gas companies maintained underground pipe networks, delivering coal gas to homes and businesses. Gas was used not only for lighting, but also increasingly for cooking and heating. The gas companies operated gasworks throughout London, producing gas by heating coal, a process that created terrible pollution and noxious byproducts. Street lighting had been revolutionized by gas. Major streets featured gas lamps that were lit each evening by lamplighters who walked their rounds with long poles, opening the gas valves and igniting the jets. The transformation from earlier oil lamp lighting to gas represented a dramatic improvement, making London streets safer and extending the hours of commerce and social activity. Water supply came from multiple private water companies that drew water from the Thames, the Lee, and from wells. The companies maintained reservoirs and pumping stations, delivering water through underground pipes. Water quality and reliability varied considerably between companies and neighborhoods. The wealthy enjoyed regular, relatively clean water. The poor often had access only 853 AMOT limited hours and from communal taps. Fire protection had improved since the establishment of the Metropolitan Fire Brigade in 1866, bringing together the multiple private fire brigades previously operated by insurance companies. The brigade maintained fire stations throughout London, equipped with steam-powered fire engines and telegraph connections allowing rapid notification of fires. However, fires remained devastating, particularly in the crowded districts where wooden buildings stood close together. Refuse collection was primitive and inadequate. In better neighborhoods, contractors collected household waste, dumping it in enormous dust heaps on London's outskirts, where it was sorted for anything valuable before being sold as fertilizer or used for landfill. In poor neighborhoods, waste accumulated in courts and alleys, removed only irregularly, if at all. The resulting smell and filth contributed to disease and degraded living conditions. Street cleaning varied by neighborhood. In fashionable districts, street sweepers removed horse droppings and debris regularly. In working-class areas, streets received minimal attention. The crossing sweepers who cleared paths through street muck for pedestrians provided a service that municipal authorities failed to deliver uniformly. The postal service was a point of Victorian pride. The penny post, established in 1840, had revolutionized communication by charging a uniform 1 penny rate regardless of distance. By 1875, the postal service was highly efficient, with multiple deliveries per day in central London. One could post a letter in the morning and receive a reply the same afternoon. Pillar boxes painted bright red collected mail throughout the city. The telegraph network connected government offices, railway stations, businesses, and even some private residences. Telegraph boys delivered messages throughout the day, providing rapid communication for those who could afford the service. The telegraph had transformed business, allowing instant coordination of commercial activities across vast distances. Transportation infrastructure represented massive capital investment. The Metropolitan Railway, the world's first underground railway, had opened in 1863, running from Paddington to Farringdon. This pioneering line used steam locomotives, making the journey through the tunnels a smoky, sulfurous ordeal. Additional underground lines had been added, creating the beginnings of the underground network that would become London's signature transport system. The underground railways supplemented the extensive surface railway network. Railway companies had built lines radiating from London in all directions, connecting the capital to every corner of Britain. The railways had transformed travel, making distances that previously required days traversable in hours. They had also transformed commerce, allowing rapid distribution of goods and enabling the development of distant suburbs. Suburban development was accelerating. Railways made it possible for middle-class workers to live in Hampstead, Richmond, Greenwich, or even further afield, commuting to central London daily. Developers built vast estates of terraced houses to accommodate this demand. These suburbs offered escape from central London's noise, dirt, and crowding while maintaining access to urban employment and culture. The growth of suburbs created new social patterns. The daily commute became a defining feature of middle-class male life. The suburban house became a domestic sanctuary, separated from the workplace in ways that had not previously been possible. The suburbs also segregated classes geographically more completely than had existed when rich and poor lived in different floors of the same neighborhoods. Parks and open spaces were recognized as essential to urban health. In addition to the older royal parks, Hyde Park, St. James's Park, Green Park, Regent's Park, new parks were being created. Victoria Park in the East End, opened in 1845, provided recreation space for working-class Londoners. Battersea Park, opened in 1858, transformed marshy riverfront into landscaped gardens and playing fields. These parks served multiple functions. They provided fresh air and green space believed essential to health. They offered venues for respectable recreation, walking, rowing, cricket, concerts. They also served as social control, providing supervised spaces where working-class leisure could be channeled into approved activities rather than the drinking and vice that reformers deplored. Public swimming baths were being built to improve working-class hygiene. Many working-class homes lacked bathing facilities, and public baths provided not only washing facilities, but also swimming pools. The movement for public baths combined public health concerns with moral improvement. Cleanliness was literally next to godliness in Victorian thinking. Hospitals were expanding, though medical care remained limited in effectiveness. The great teaching hospitals trained doctors and provided care to the poor. Specialized hospitals treated particular conditions, the Brompton Hospital for consumption, the Royal Hospital for diseases of the chest, the London Fever Hospital, lying in hospitals provided maternity care, though childbirth remained dangerous. Asylums housed the mentally ill, removed from families unable to care for them. Treatment was minimal: restraint, basic care, perhaps moral treatment that assumed mental illness resulted from poor moral fiber. The massive county asylums built outside London housed thousands of patients in institutions that were more warehouses than hospitals. Chapter 7: Empire, Commerce, and London's Global Reach. London in 1875 was not merely a city, but the command center of a global empire and the hub of international commerce. The wealth flowing through London and the power wielded from its government offices affected hundreds of millions of people across the world. The British Empire had reached its zenith. Britain controlled approximately 1/4 of the world's land surface and ruled over a similar proportion of its population. India was the jewel in the crown, governed by the British Raj following the suppression of the Indian Rebellion of 1857 and the dissolution of the East India Company. Queen Victoria would be proclaimed Empress of India in 1876, a title that formalized Britain's dominance over the subcontinent. The colonies provided raw materials that fed British industry and consumers that purchased British manufactured goods. Australian wool, Canadian timber, South African gold and diamonds, West Indian sugar, Indian cotton and tea, Malayan rubber. The list was extensive. British ships carried these goods to London's docks, where they were processed, traded, and often re-exported. The City of London was the world's financial capital. Banks, insurance companies, and trading houses financed global commerce. British capital funded railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, plantations in Ceylon. Yet the London of 1875 represented a historical moment when a city and a nation believed themselves to be at the apex of human achievement, the model for the world's future. Understanding that moment, with all its achievements and horrors, its magnificence and misery, provides essential insight into how the modern world emerged from Victorian foundations.